All right, welcome to our session today on stress management. This is the first workshop that I'm actually doing with through Pro. Obviously, with everything that we've got going on over the last little while with the pandemic, this topic of stress management, you can imagine, has been pretty popular. And I made a little bit of revisions, and this is jam-packed with a ton of information. So I'm going to talk a little fast, but I still want it to be somewhat interactive. So if you guys have questions, if you feel comfortable, you can put those in chat. You can unmute yourself. And then hopefully I'll provide as much value as possible to you to help you with this process in the midst of the pandemic, as well as people that you might be either stuck at home with or interacting with that tend to have a difficult time with the stress. So here's what the agenda is actually going to look at. First off, we're going to talk about the actual stress response. One of the things I find, I didn't introduce myself. So my name is Robin Lavich. I'm a coach, consultant, and a trainer. I have a company called Surpass Your Goals. I specialize in anything related to dealing with people. I have a master's degree in psychology. I'm certified as a coach, and I'm actually doing my doctorate in human behavior. And so stress obviously fits nicely as we talk about human behavior. So we're going to talk about the stress response. And the reason I'm doing that is I believe that when we have a better understanding of the science in terms of what's happening with our body, that understanding itself tends to minimize some of the stress because we have more clarity on how we're operating. Then we'll talk about the stress impact. The intent of that is to give you motivation to manage the stress response, because managing the stress requires us to form more habits, and the requirement of more habits tends to create more stress. So I hope that's motivating enough for you when you know the impact that this becomes a priority. And then we'll actually talk about specific stress management strategies. We're going to talk about strategies based off of how to change your mindset and your thoughts, how to manage your emotions, and then what are some particular behaviors that we can actually implement as well. Here are some scary stats. 75 to 90% of all doctor visits are stress related. 73 to 77% of people regularly suffer from physical and psychological symptoms. And stress is the basic cause of 60% of all illness and all disease. These stats, by the way, have nothing to do with the pandemic. So we haven't even begun to see what the impact is of the pandemic and some of the other political and other charged situations that we're actually in the midst of living in. So we're going to talk today about how to actually uninstall stress. Does that sound good for you guys? Every once in a while, I'm going to stop and see if you guys have any questions. And you can put stuff in the chat bar if you would like. And where is my chat bar? Oh, we'll come back to that. So let's talk about stress. So the way that we're wired physically is that if we're in the midst of a dangerous situation, and that actually creates what's called a threat response for us, then that puts us into a fight or flight situation where we actually need to protect our survival. So if we see a tiger coming at us, our brain is not even going to be thinking rationally. We're just going to go quickly into how best to handle it. And do we want to fight the situation, or do we want to flee from the situation? And that's pretty much an involuntary type situation. What most people don't realize is the fight-flight response can be because there's a physical threat, like a tiger, but it could also happen in the midst of what's called a psychological threat. So if we were feeling isolated, or we were worried we were going to get blamed for something, or maybe we felt rejected, all of those types of situations create a psychological threat. And our body does not distinguish between a real physical threat versus a psychological threat. So when I talk about the threat response, it's not just if we were being chased by a tiger. It could be that if we're threatened by some of the interactions that we have with other people. So once our body goes into this fight or flight response, it actually releases a chemical cascade and a metabolic cascade. So our muscles get tense, our breathing tends to quicken, our heart rate goes up, and then our digestion actually shuts down. So in terms of a little bit about the science, let me show you what's happening within the brain. So there's a part of the brain called the amygdala, and I don't know if you've all heard of the amygdala hijack, but it's towards the back of the brain in the brainstem, and it's part of the limbic system. And the limbic system actually is responsible for controlling emotions as well as controlling memories. And then we have the front part of the brain, which is here, which is called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where we have executive functioning and self-control. That's where we make rational decisions and we're not so emotional. So if you consider something like road rage, that's a complete amygdala hijack. There's no rational thought in any of that. We've just completely triggered an amygdala response, which is a high emotion. And the role of the amygdala is to try to scour the environment to determine if there's any threat response and if there's any threats. And if it's deemed that there is a threat, then the amygdala actually gets triggered. And that sets a whole wave of different chemicals. A couple of chemicals that are released when the amygdala is triggered is epinephrine or adrenaline. That prepares us that if there's a tiger coming, that we can actually run away from it or flee from it. So we need that adrenaline to give us that extra energy. And it releases what's called pro-inflammatory chemicals. The reason why that's important is because that initial threat response is very helpful to our initial survival. And what it does is it creates this inflammatory response so we're better able to deal with the situation. And that's great if that happens in the short term. If that happens in the long term and your body is continually inflamed, that's what actually creates the disease. The other chemical that's released is called cortisol. Cortisol, you may know, is related to the stress hormone. Cortisol, this is what's fascinating. When cortisol is released in the system, it stays in your system for almost 30 hours. And so if you're under chronic stress, then you have high levels of cortisol continuously. And cortisol is actually related to our circadian rhythms. So high levels of cortisol will actually impact our sleep and our appetite. Appetite meaning, I don't know, if you've not slept well the night before, you'll start craving sugary foods, you'll start craving carbs and fats. That's actually as a result of too much cortisol. And it'll prevent the growth and repair and actually alter our gene expression, which I'll talk about in a minute. So when we look at the psychological response, here's the difference between an acute stress, meaning short term, versus long term and chronic. If we're being chased by a bear and immediately we mobilize into this fight or flight response and we take off and we realize that we've outrun the bear and we're now safe, then we're like, phew, right? And we have a chance to actually recover. That's how our body was designed, is release all of those chemicals and then prepare us for a very intense situation and then stop and allow our body to recover. Unfortunately, that's not often what we do because there's a perception of stress. So for instance, if you're driving down a country road and you're thoroughly enjoying the scenery, maybe you're on vacation, everything is beautiful, you actually quite enjoy the drive. If, however, you're in day-to-day rush hour traffic, you're hating the drive. And the driving is actually the same, although you might start and stop, but it's our perception of that event that actually creates the stress. We oftentimes talk about all the things that are responsible for stress, but we don't actually realize that it's our perception of that stress that is what's most detrimental. So one of the things, I love learning. So when I'm driving, I love putting in webinars and audiobooks. One of the things I've actually missed in the midst of the pandemic is I'm not driving as much. And so I have a hard time actually watching a webinar. A live webinar I'm fine with, but a recorded webinar, I have a hard time just sitting still and watching that. But when I'm in my car and I'm listening to it, it's like education on wheels. I actually love it. So even though I'm in bumper to bumper traffic, my perception of that is there's no threat. I'm actually able to learn. So if we alter our perception of things, we can actually alter the impact of that stress on us. And just to give you a staggering statistic, that chemical reaction that's released in the midst of stress, if you're really pissed off and you're angry, because that's one angry baby there, 15 minutes of anger actually releases the same amount of toxins into your body as smoking an entire pack of cigarettes. So we really have to get to the point where we're able to alter our perceptions and manage our emotions so that we're not doing long-term damage to our body. When we have high levels of cortisol within our body, it impacts every organ and every system within our body. It decreases our sensitivity to pain. So sometimes people that have back pain, neck pain don't realize that that's actually exacerbated by stress. It impacts heart disease, high blood sugar. This is crazy. High blood pressure as well, but it actually releases glucose. And so if you're eating a lot of fatty foods, the cortisol, or fat and sugar and carbs, and our body has to release insulin to actually deal with that, the stress is also releasing that glucose, which, by the way, if you try to lose weight, I know I've heard the COVID-15 or COVID-19, 19 standing for the 19 pounds the average person has gained in the midst of the pandemic. Super hard to try to lose weight and actually stick with a diet routine when you're in the midst of stress. It suppresses your immune system. That's because it has that inflammatory response, as I mentioned, high blood pressure, and then actually alters our memory and our attention. So even though our body is equipped to be able to deal with stress to protect our survival, it's meant to do that on a short-term basis. It's not meant to be chronic and in the long term. And what most people don't realize is cortisol actually attaches to certain sites of your DNA, and then it actually alters your genes. So there's a new field out, really fascinating, called epigenetics. And epigenetics basically shows that how we interact with the environment literally alters our genes. And so if we have genes, let's say for certain diseases, something like cancer, and we're dealing with stress, if the cortisol attaches to that DNA site, it's almost like a light switch where it turns on and activates that genetic component. So even if we had a genetic component for something like cancer, given how we deal with the environment and also our nutrition and all the rest of it, impacts our genes, and then the expression of our genes. So epigenetics basically shows that we literally can alter our genes and the gene expression. So mentally what's happening, and you might be able to relate to some of this, is that when we have high levels of cortisol and when we're dealing with chronic stress, mentally we end up becoming very distracted. It increases our anxiety, our emotional reactions. We tend to get more irritable and less patient. We tend to see threats everywhere. We tend to view people as very hostile. So even if we were dealing with somebody and it was a neutral type situation, we tend to see them as far more hostile. It impacts our ability to remember things and recall things. It impacts our performance. Our intelligence actually diminishes, and then it gives us a very narrow perspective. And so one other component that's really important when we're dealing with chronic stress is gut health. So there's an actual connection between our brain and our gut. And what happens when our brain is activated in terms of stress is it impacts the bacteria or the microbiome in our stomach. And here's what's fascinating. Serotonin, which is a happy chemical, 90% of the receptors are actually in our tummy. And so when we're stressed out and we go into fight-flight response, that's the opposite of what's called feed and breed. When we're relaxed, we're able to actually eat and digest our food. And then, of course, that protects our survival because we're able to procreate. But when we're stressed, it actually shuts down our digestion. And so all the nutrients and whatnot that we need are not actually being absorbed in the same way because of the high levels of cortisol and the high levels of stress. So as a result of chronic stress, we'll see symptoms that are physical, psychological, and then lifestyle. Lifestyle meaning that there's different changes in our habits and how we handle things. So when we're dealing with physical stress symptoms and psychological stress symptoms, we'll see things like confusion, negativity, lack of focus, much more conflict, exhaustion, insecurity, and even isolation. People tend to withdraw from other people. I was just talking to a colleague of mine that was asking me to be a guest speaker on a show that he's doing related to Alzheimer's. And what he wanted me to talk about was all the conflict, not between the patient that has Alzheimer's, but all of the other people that are actually involved. And what he said to me was, his father had Alzheimer's. So what he said to me is, I made a very practical decision, but all of the other people around me were emotional. And I slightly chuckled and said, you might think you made a practical decision, but there's not a chance that him dealing with his father in Alzheimer's, he wasn't actually having stress symptoms that were also psychological. And so when you're dealing with that, it actually distorts how we interpret other people's intentions, and creates a whole lot more conflict. Let me ask you guys, what do you think is the number one physical symptom of stress? Do you think, and you guys can put this, you can either unmute yourself and say it, or you can put it in the chat if you'd like. Although I'm still not seeing the chat. There it is. Do you think the number one physical symptom is headaches, insomnia, backache, stomach ache, or fatigue? What do you guys think? Insomnia, fatigue, stomach ache, headache, fatigue, fatigue, fatigue. Well, it looks like the majority of you guys think it's actually fatigue. It is actually insomnia. And that's because, remember, I mentioned that when that cortisol is released, it actually alters our circadian rhythms. So the first symptom that you'll actually see is insomnia. And insomnia can present either where you have a hard time actually falling asleep, or maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and then you have a hard time falling asleep after that. But there are the other physical symptoms as well, right? Headache is number 2 physical symptom. And then you've got a lot of aches and pains, backache, neck ache. You'll see stomach issues. That's because of the gut-brain connection. And then, of course, fatigue. The reason why there's such a high level of fatigue with stress is your body is being prepared for that fight-flight response. And if you're not stepping back from that and giving yourself an opportunity to actually recover from that, then your body just becomes exhausted and it can no longer deal with the ongoing stress. So the last component, we've got psychological impact, we've got physical impact, and then we also have lifestyle changes. Binge eating becomes far more prevalent. Alcohol, negative type habits that we have, drug use, all kinds of substance abuse, and everything ends up being escalated. Smoking, higher levels of defensiveness. I don't know if you guys experienced that in the pandemic, which is probably why they're saying, you know, the quarantine 15 is a lot of times people will crave different types of food when they're actually stressed out and tend to binge a whole lot more. So if we look at the impact of the coronavirus, one of the things I noticed early on, and it's kind of interesting at this point, right? We're going into like month 4. Never did I imagine that it would be such a prolonged period of time. But even initially, when we looked at the first month or the first couple of months, I found that there were people that went to one of 2 extremes. On one end, they became Chicken Little. And on the other end, they became the ostrich. Chicken Little is like, oh my God, the sky is falling, the world is coming to an end. Those are all the people that ran out and bought as much toilet paper as possible because they thought that was just going to be the end of the world. And then the ostrich effect is, I'm just going to bury my head. I'm not really going to deal with anything. And I'm just going to hope that, you know, one day I wake up and everything is back to normal and off we can go. And the unfortunate thing when you're in the ostrich effect or denial is you're doing things to try to cope with the stress without actually dealing with the stress directly. And so what that does is it leads us to either running or either numbing. Running is where we try to do as many things as possible to stay busy so we don't have to think about things and we don't actually have to be aware of physically how we're feeling. And so we try to put ourselves in go, 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 go mode. And with the pandemic, for the people that were at home and things kind of slowed down, that was actually a harder thing to do, is to keep yourself as busy as possible. So a lot of people ended up numbing. And numbing is where we're just trying not to deal with anything. So that's why you saw a surge in binge eating, a surge in alcohol sales, and all kinds of things, because people didn't know how to deal with what they were experiencing and what they were feeling. So they were just trying to push it all down. What we want to learn in terms of stress management is how to actually manage our emotions. So it's totally fine to be angry, but we don't necessarily want to be out of control. And so the same is true with anxiety. We can certainly be anxious, but we don't want it to be to the point where we end up having panic attacks or where we actually become paralyzed. So if you look at these three stages, this is one of the things I observed with people in the midst of the pandemic. The first stage was high alert, right? Which is actually a very strong mechanism that protects us, because we're not sure what to expect. And so we become very hyper vigilant in terms of watching things and being alert for things. Over time, though, because that stress continued, that led to a higher level of distraction. So it was much harder to stay focused. A lot of people reported things like brain fog, memory loss. And then the third stage is where you just felt reactive. And I see this like everywhere. Even if I'm out and I'm driving or I'm at the store, people have very little tolerance. People are easily angered, highly irritable. And that's because they've been in this prolonged stress state for a long period of time. If you had to look at yourselves and identify these three stages, do you feel like you're in one stage more so than another? The fourth stage, of course, would be calm, but I don't necessarily think that's the most common state that people are in. So you want to put in the chat if you feel like you're in alert, distracted, or reactive. Where do you fall with all that? Alert, distracted, good. Alert and distracted, reactive, typically, yeah, that's what happens when we're not able to actually recover. Being alert and being distracted is happens before we get to this very reactive state. So if we're aware that we're in alert or that we're distracted, we're able to recognize that we're under a stress response before it gets to the point where we're totally stressed out. If the stress continues for a very prolonged period of time, the signs of severe stress is obviously going to lead to depression, sadness, feelings of hopelessness. Then we've got the physical symptoms, headaches, colds, flu, the insomnia, which we talked about, the impact of work performance. This will lead to substance abuse and even suicidal ideations. There's a lot more reports now that are coming out about the high rate of suicide, and that's a direct reflection of the amount of stress that people are dealing with. And so all of that, when we're dealing with severe stress, that's what's leading to a lot of physical symptoms. So high levels of stress is actually related to diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular issues, autoimmune, obesity, diabetes, cancer, you name it. We're not meant physically to be under a high level of stress. So what we need to learn to do, and here's the thing, in a time like in COVID, where there's all this stress, not necessarily so much as a result of the virus itself. I mean, there are different reactions where some people are worried about getting sick, particularly, if you're in the elderly population, and some people aren't. But the changes that happened in terms of not being able to work, having new policies, concerns with finances, concerns with the market, all of that is what was creating the high level of stress. Having to work from home when you have kids, all of that. And so we need to learn to figure out how to actually tame the stress so that our health is not compromised. And the ironic thing is, if we're worried about all of those other things in the market, in the economy, like our finances, if we've got more conflict with people, all of that, as that's going on, that's actually compromising our immune system. And of course, the best protection that we have against the virus is the immune system. So hopefully everybody's highly motivated at this point to actually learn to tame the stress. No matter what strategy I talk about, at some point, it's going to come down to you have to be able to relax. And I don't recommend, by the way, if you know somebody that's stressed out, you tell them to relax, because telling somebody who's stressed out to relax, you're likely going to get slapped, because they very well may know that that's what they actually need to do. But a lot of times knowing what we need to do and then actually doing it are two very different things. So the first thing is that we actually have to recognize where we are in terms of stress. I used to say this, that I knew when I was really stressed out, right? I knew when I was at my limit. So on a scale of 1 to 10, it was completely apparent when I was at a 10, but I was not good at knowing when I was at a 3. And so if you're really going to manage your stress, you have to be able to manage it when you're at a 2, when you're at a 3, when you're at a 4. You don't want to wait till you get to the point where you're at a 10, because at that point you already have damage that's occurring, either literally with your physical being or in your relationships, certainly in your work performance. So the first thing we want to do when we're talking about stress management is to actually identify where we are on a scale of 1 to 10 and how stressed out we actually are. Another thing that we want to do is become a dopamine dealer. Dopamine will actually downregulate some of the impact of cortisol within our system. And dopamine is a happy chemical that actually motivates us and allows us to take action. I don't know if you were in a situation where you had all this work to do and you had all of these ideas, but you just completely lacked the motivation because you were so fatigued. That's likely because your dopamine levels are really, really low. And a couple of ways that we can actually enhance dopamine naturally, obviously with the types of foods that we have. If you use food that has tyrosine in it, if you exercise regularly, meditate, get a massage. We talked about the mind-gut connection, but there's a nerve called the vagus nerve that actually runs from the brain all the way to our gut. And when that nerve is activated, that sets the rest and digest. So that's what actually calms us. So when we look at things like massage and exercise, a lot of those things are actually activating that nerve, which is the vagus nerve, which is what's allowing us to relax. So we want to be diligent about how we do that. And then, of course, all the strategies I talk about will actually help with dopamine and stress management too. So before I jump into the strategies to manage stress, do we have any questions, any comments that you guys want to bring up that I can answer? You can just type that into chat or just unmute yourselves. Anybody? If nothing, I'll move on. What foods release dopamine? The foods that are rich in tyrosine, I put these in my notes in case somebody asked that. Almonds, bananas, avocados, eggs, bean, fish, and chicken. So almonds, by the way, almonds also have tryptophan. So you know how when you have a turkey dinner, you get tired afterwards? That's because it has tryptophan. And tryptophan has a natural calming, and it actually is one of the precursors, I believe, for serotonin. So almonds will actually help with dopamine as well as almonds. And that will actually help with your sleep. So one of the things I actually do is eat a handful of almonds before I go to bed. Good for you, but also has some of those supplements. What are the best practices to relax? So we're going to talk about how to actually relax in terms of stress management. So we're going to break this down into 4 categories. One of the ways to manage your stress is to actually just enhance a little bit more about your understanding of stress, how to manage emotions, how to manage thoughts, and then how to manage actions. So let's talk about a little bit more about the science of stress and how we can best manage that. First off, I want to mention there's a difference between threat stress, like we talked about the fight flight response, and then also challenge stress. Challenge stress is kind of a good type of stress. Challenge stress is the sense that I'm excited about something, I'm nervous about something, but I still feel capable of doing it. Whereas threat stress, your body goes into that fight flight response. So obviously for me to do a presentation this morning, I had a higher level of stress this morning than I would on a day that I'm not giving a presentation, but it's not a fight flight response. I'm not completely stressed out about giving a presentation. I'm under challenge stress. And that releases just enough adrenaline so that my focus, my memory, and everything is actually enhanced. And so one of the ways that we can alter whether we're in threat stress or whether we're in challenge stress is recognizing the resources that we have. If we feel like I have the resources and everything that I need to actually cope, then it'll put me in a challenge stress, which is good. And if I feel like I'm not going to be able to handle this, meaning I'm not going to be able to cope, I don't have the resources that I need, then that'll put me in a threat response. So yeah, you're not crazy. Drivers out there are actually worse. I actually believe that the more this continues, like we haven't even begun to see the fallout of people trying to manage with the stress. And how can you tell the difference between challenge stress and threat stress? Is that what you're asking, Sarah? I feel the same in both situations. The way that you can actually tell is when you're in challenge stress, you're very focused. And although you might have a little bit more adrenaline, it doesn't seem overwhelming. When you're under a threat response, you don't actually have mental clarity. Your body is just preparing to fight or flight. But when you're in challenge stress, you actually have a high level of focus and a high level of attention, which is good for you. Keeps you on your toes and helps you out with your performance. But it's almost like once you feel like I can't deal with it, then your body goes into this fight flight response, and then you're in that stress mode. Here's something else to know about generally human behavior is we have what's called a negativity bias. A negativity bias means that when we scour the environment, we're generally looking for potential threats. That actually protects our survival. And so we inherently look for things that are negative because it protects our survival. We don't have the same reaction with positive type events. Positive types events are nice, but it doesn't actually protect our survival. So I'll give you an example. I hate snakes. I hate this slide to even put it up. But when I take my dogs to the dog park, the last time I went, I saw a snake. And I didn't want it to trigger this whole amygdala response, right? And get myself all stressed out. So I practiced some breathing and the snake slithered off and I just continued walking. And then I literally took 2 more steps and I saw another snake. And then I was done. It triggered a threat response because now I was like, oh my God, the snakes are like everywhere. And then what's interesting is as I'm walking, everywhere I look, I'm like, oh, that's another snake. Oh, that's another snake. And they were branches. They were twigs. They weren't even snakes. And so what people don't realize is that we're typically focused on what could actually hurt us. And then when that amygdala gets triggered, we take any neutral event, a twig, and we see it as a threat. So that means that, and this is why you might see people driving like crazy, is they'll start thinking literally that other people are doing things just to upset them, right? Oh, that person's going slow and stopping just to annoy me. They're now doing that on purpose. They start viewing very neutral type situations in a very negative way. This happens with work colleagues as well, where somebody might do something that if you weren't stressed out, you would just understand like they were looking at it in a different way or was a difference of opinion. But all of a sudden when you're stressed out, it almost becomes personal and it was intentional and they did this just to upset you. Absolutely profound, which is why I like to share this with people because we tend to make decisions. A lot of times we have to make decisions when we're really stressed out. And if we're not aware that our decision making is actually compromised because now we see negative everywhere, we don't end up making the best decisions. I know cortisol is in your system for almost 30 hours. And that's if your amygdala was triggered. But here's the thing. If you continue thinking about that situation, even after the fact, and you're ruminating about it, your body is continually releasing that cortisol. And so if I've been upset by something, and here's the thing, I teach this for a living. I work with clients one-on-one on this type of stuff. And it's not as though I don't get triggered. It's a normal human reaction. But I'm doing everything I can at that point to actually release that cortisol so that I'm not continually triggering it. And if I have to make a decision, I'm not making a decision that if it's a tough decision, I'm not dealing with that day when I'm triggered, because it's going to skew how I view everything. The other thing to really understand is that emotions are contagious. So just like our body is, our brain is connecting with neurochemicals, and there's chemical reactions, that happens throughout our body. And so as we release those types of chemicals, we actually have a 3-foot electromagnetic field around us. And so we're not totally aware of it, but our chemical reactions are coming through our skin, right? We're secreting that. And so if you're around somebody that's like highly anxious, you're actually absorbing that negative emotion, and it's impacting your chemical reaction. I was just reading an article about, and I have a client too that told me her dog is really anxious. She had to take her dog to the vet. And my first thought was, I wonder how much of that is related to her own anxiety, because she tends to be a very anxious person. And so your pets, your family members, people that you're around are actually picking up on your emotional state. I know in the pandemic, at first, when I would go out, I didn't even want to go out because I could literally feel the anxiety everywhere I went. And I call it splat, where people are just throwing all this negative energy on me, and I really didn't want it. If I'm going to be stressed out, it's because I'm going to make myself stressed out, not because I'm standing next to somebody who is stressed out, right? And I got to kind of clear all that out. So if we know about the emotional contagion, that what we want to do is actually figure out how best to manage our emotions. And there are basically 7 primary emotions. These are 7 here. So we've got disgust, anger, sadness, surprise, fear, and joy. Here's what's really interesting is most people aren't aware of how they're actually feeling about things. They don't know what the emotion is. People will say to me all the time, I'm stressed. Stressed isn't really an emotion, right? Stressed is either anxious, feeling overwhelmed, maybe a combination of anxiety with anger. But we have to learn how to actually identify what it is that we're feeling, because emotions supply us information. So anger, it basically comes about because we feel like something is unjust, it's not fair. Whereas anxiety comes about because we feel like we're not capable of dealing with something. So if you feel angry, it actually mobilizes you to fix the situation. Consider, all the protests and the unrest that created. That's anger as a result of things not being fair, things not being just. Anxiety, on the other hand, actually almost paralyzes you because you withdraw from the situation. And so if you're not aware of whether you're angry or whether you're anxious, then you're not actually gaining the information you need to actually solve that. So the minute that you can actually label that emotion, you're better able to deal with it. And here's the thing. The emotion is being triggered by the amygdala, but labeling the emotion is actually using the prefrontal cortex. So while our amygdala is triggered, we don't have full use of the prefrontal cortex. And that's where our executive functioning is coming from. It's kind of like trying to having a rational conversation with somebody who is wasted drunk. There's no point, right? They don't have that cognitive ability. Well, that's what happens when your amygdala gets triggered. So the moment you can identify what the emotion is, you're now using the prefrontal cortex. You're using a different part of your brain. And so that actually subsides part of the emotion. Really, really good strategy if you're at like a moderate level of emotion. If you're in road rage and asking somebody, how do you feel? Again, not going to be your best tactic. But if somebody is kind of like worked up and they're in a moderate thing, identifying how they feel will actually downregulate some of that cortisol and the amygdala activation. The other thing that we can do to deal with some of our emotions is create what's called a positivity list. So there's a theorist called Barbara Fredrickson that's done a lot of research in terms of positive emotions. Now, I mentioned to you that when I saw a snake, everywhere I looked, I then saw another snake, right? Not only does it change how I view things, and so I tend to view things in a threat response, but it also gets seared into my memory. So anytime I go back to that dog park, I know exactly where I saw that snake. And as soon as I start approaching it, I'm already thinking about the snake. That doesn't happen with positive emotions. I had asked a client, when's the last time you saw a rainbow? And she was like, oh, I just saw one the other day going over Gulf to Bay. And I was like, so now every time you go over Gulf to Bay, you think of the rainbow? Well, no, because it doesn't get seared in your brain in the same way. We remember a threat response because it protects our survival, but seeing a rainbow doesn't actually protect our survival. So we actually have to learn how to harness positive emotions in order to feel them in the same way that we feel negative emotions. And there's a training I'm actually putting together called Harnessing Happiness, because we actually have to be taught how to do that. We already know that we have a propensity towards negative to begin with. Now we know that in terms of our memory, we're more likely going to remember a negative event, and then a positive event doesn't even have the same impact. Is this like non-conscious versus conscious? Yeah, amygdala is involuntary, completely unconscious. You can't really control it. You can control it in the sense of, so if the brain is like a muscle, if you constantly trigger your amygdala, you actually strengthen the amygdala response. So most people don't realize that if they're constantly triggering that as a muscle, it's actually growing in size and it's strengthening. And then it's making you more likely to be reactive towards stress. If you're focused on utilizing your prefrontal cortex, which is your rational thought, labeling your emotions, then that muscle actually grows. And that's actually why there's such profound effects with meditation and mindfulness, which I'll talk about in a minute. Is it actually is using the prefrontal cortex and building that up as a muscle. So in that regard, using your prefrontal cortex can become conscious. But the amygdala is unconscious. It's constantly scanning the environment as a threat response. That's actually just how we're wired. So back to the positive emotions, they found that in order to have a sense of well-being, there needs to be a 3-to-1 ratio of positive to negative type events. And yet studies show that our thoughts throughout the day, 70% are negative. 20% are neutral, like, what I need to buy from the grocery store, and then 10% are positive. So if we're really going to strengthen this muscle and balance out some of the negativity, we have to be diligent about creating a positivity list. The other thing that's really important to know is that the brain actually changes when we experience positive emotions. And so the broaden and build theory basically shows that when we experience a positive emotions, it actually creates novel connections within the brain, strengthens those connections within the brain, allows us to be more creative, more effective at problem solving. And so it expands our repertoire of resources and basically helps us become resilient. When we are in a negative state, our perspective actually narrows. So if you imagine like, I'm taking the dogs to the park and I'm walking and all of a sudden I saw a snake. Now when I'm looking at all the twigs and all the branches, I'm completely unaware of everything else that's going on in the environment because I'm completely fixated on seeing a snake. When you're in a positive state of mind, you get a much broader perspective and it's more effective for your performance, your creativity, and your problem solving. So we can actually harness positive emotions like gratitude, compassion, and empathy. When we're in a threat response, we no longer see people as people, we see them as objects. And so empathy is being able, and compassion is about seeing people as people and considering where they're coming from. And if we can learn to harness those emotions, one of the things I did a couple of years ago was my New Year's resolution is every night before I went to bed, I would say three things that I was grateful for. And the studies, and it was really effective. It actually helped me sleep better, right? Because it's down regulating that cortisol. Positive emotions down regulate all the negative emotions. So it helped me sleep better. I actually woke up with a better frame of mind. And studies show that it's such a simple activity that can absolutely help us. So I don't necessarily identify all the things I'm grateful for when I go to bed, but I want to feel the sense of gratitude. And so I say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, repeatedly when I go to sleep so that I harness the feeling of gratitude. Obviously, love is another positive emotion that will release part of cortisol. This is my dog and my cat. And that's a new cat that I have that absolutely loves my dog. That's Tank, and that's Keto. And so in this moment, I can actually look at this picture, even like when I see them together, it just makes me feel love, right? And love is a super powerful emotion to actually deal with negative emotions. Another thing that we can do is actually experience laughter. So do you guys ever watch that show, Whose Line Is It Anyways? I had started taping it. It makes me laugh. So every day when I would watch the news, I would only watch the news for 1 hour. I limited that, which, by the way, you guys might want to consider doing that. So I would limit the media exposure, but as soon as I watched the media and everything that was happening, I then would watch a comedy show because I wanted to downregulate all that negativity that I just absorbed. Social media guidance in regard to stress. I will get to that shortly. Okay, number 2, let's talk about how we can actually shift our thoughts and our mindset to best handle stress. Now, remember, we talked about stress a lot of times is totally self-induced, and we don't even realize that we're doing it ourselves, but it's because of our perception of stress or our perception of events. So there are what are called ants. Ants are automatic negative thoughts that sometimes we're not aware of, but we tend to think the worst, right? If you're worried about finances and you start thinking, oh, I'm never going to be able to pay my bills, right? I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage. I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to end up being hopeless or homeless and hopeless. That's like negative thoughts that are just being compounded. And that thought is going to trigger an unbelievable amount of cortisol. And a lot of times people aren't aware that they have these thoughts that just continually get worse and worse and worse. And that's releasing all kinds of negative chemicals. So we have to first be aware of the thoughts, and then we actually have to challenge them. So the strategy to deal with our thoughts is to detect the thoughts, identify them, challenge them, and replace them. I was talking to a girl yesterday, a young girl. I do teen coaching as well. And she's not a teen. She's like 22. And she just moved back in with her parents, and her younger brother isn't taking the social distancing very well. And so it's stressing her out. And so when I talked to her, I was trying to get to the point of it's stressing her out. Why? I'm teaching her, like, what are the thoughts? So the thoughts was, he's more likely going to get sick, right? Then he's going to get the family sick. I'm worried my dad is elderly, right? And so he might end up dying. If I get sick, I'm going to be sick for 2 weeks. I'm not going to be able to work. I'm not going to be able to make money. I'm not going to be able to take care of my responsibilities. And so her brother's decision to go out with friends is to the point where, her dad is going to die. So I wanted her to detect and identify that those were the thoughts that were actually creating the stress. Her brother was not the one creating the stress. Her thoughts were the ones that were creating the stress. So now remember, A threat response is triggered because we don't think like we're going to be able to deal with it. So I said, you know, even if it impacted your finances, do you think you would be able to cope with that? And she was like, well, yeah. And you could kind of hear her relax and sigh a breath of relief. And so we talked about how to actually replace some of those thoughts. Another thing we can do with our thoughts is to consider and reframe certain things. Kind of like if you look at what happened with like the oceans clearing up and the impact that the pandemic has positively had on the ecosystem, I find that tremendous. So sometimes, and it's not like we want to be in denial. I'm not advocating for that, but we want to get to the point where we actually have a broader perspective and we see that there are good things that come out of negative type situations. And so the next thing we can do is begin to alter our actions and alter our behaviors. Mindfulness, which is activating the prefrontal cortex, there's all different things, different types of things that you can do for mindfulness. Mindfulness basically means where you're in the present moment without judgment. You're paying attention to something. So a good strategy for mindfulness is why the mandalas and coloring all of that in is really effective, is it's very intricate and it requires all of your attention to actually color something in. And so it's great for stress reduction. And there's no judgment. And that's the key, is we want to be in the present moment, but we don't want to be evaluating things. Another way that we can be mindful is conduct what's called a body scan. So you might not be aware of right now, even your physical positioning, like what's the position of your feet. And if you check in with yourself and kind of look at what's going on with my feet, where are my legs, how am I sitting, that puts us fully into the present moment. So we want to be in touch with what's going on with our body. Then there's a 3-minute breathing space. Breathing is the easiest, well, it is the simplest thing to do to manage stress, but much easier said than done. And let me just tell you, there's breathing to relax and breathing to create a panic attack. So when we go into the fight-flight response, our breathing becomes very shallow, right? We end up breathing from our lungs. And that actually tells the brain, right, we're under a threat response, so we've got to get all that oxygen to our extremities so that we can prepare to take off. When we're in rest and digest, our breathing needs to go all the way to our tummy, and then we need to exhale much longer than we inhale. That signifies to the body that we're relaxed. So if you think about it, I like doing this with Tank. When I'm laying next to Tank, when the dog is like totally relaxed, when he exhales, he's like, right? He's just totally, that's how he's sleeping. And so it always reminds me to be focused on my own breathing by checking in with how my dog is breathing, because they just do it naturally. Another thing that is really good, obviously, is exercise. Exercise allows us to release that cortisol and downregulate things, while at the same time infusing us with positive chemicals. You might want to consider nutrition. I recently took a DNA test to find out what foods I have sensitivities to. So cheese is actually a really big one. I used to love cheese. I do not anymore now that I've seen the impact of it. But my body has, if you have a food sensitivity, it creates an inflammatory response in the body. The inflammatory response in the body is identical to a stress response. So what happens if I eat cheese, and I'm able to recognize this now because I usually don't, but like if I were to turn around and eat pizza, which I won't touch it now, but I certainly did a lot of experiments in the past. So if I wasn't used to eating cheese and I turned around and ate cheese, instantly that night I would have insomnia. Because remember, it's creating inflammation, which then releases the cortisol, which impacts the circadian rhythm. So, and then it'll impact my sleep for like 3 to 4 days if I have cheese, depending on how much. It makes me highly anxious. And that's because of all the serotonin receptors in your stomach. It makes me very irritable, and it gives me brain fog. So if I decide to have a piece of pizza, one of the things I'm evaluating in my head is, do I want to be anxious for 4 days? Do I want to lose sleep for 4 days? And at this point, there's no piece of pizza that's worth that for me. But a lot of times we're not aware the things that we're putting in our body is actually creating emotional reactions. This goes to the question of limit your media intake. Studies actually show that the longer you're on media, whether that be the news or social media, the more depressed and anxious it makes you. So you should limit that. The window of time where you're actually able to connect with somebody, but it doesn't actually increase the negative emotions, is an hour across all platforms. And for some of you that are online, you know, for hours on an end, that might be very difficult. But I swear to you, if you do a media detox, you'll immediately feel better. And if you had, I can't remember who asked that question, but if you had specific questions on that, just let me know. Did I learn the food sensitivity through muscle testing? Can I recommend a practitioner? Yes. Initially, I did it from muscle testing, but now I do it from DNA. And so with the DNA, I actually take a swab, I take a little bit of my hair, and they actually evaluate how all of my systems operate, how my metabolism is operating, how my kidneys are operating, all of that. And I like that better than the muscle testing, because the muscle testing, I was taking massive amounts of supplements. Although I healed my adrenals, was taking massive amounts of supplements, and I had to go every couple of weeks because your body was changing. The DNA, they would prescribe me certain supplements, and I would recheck that every 3 months. So I found that a lot more manageable and more, I loved the muscle testing, but the DNA component was scientific. So I'm happy to send you guys both. My email, you guys, let me put it in here. You guys can email me questions if you want the slides. I'm happy to share these with you. If you want recommendations for anything, just feel free to shoot me an email. I do want to mention there's all kinds of different types of self-care, and we don't always holistically look at all of them, but in order to be well balanced, we actually want to look at all of these. So if you consider these 8 dimensions of self-care, you can begin to identify for yourself where you need to focus in on. And I'm going to leave you with this quote. It takes no more effort to expect the best than to fear the worst. It's healthier, more productive, and a whole lot more fun. I know we're at time right now. I'm happy to continue for a little bit longer if you guys have questions. If you want to know about any upcoming events that I have, Bounce is actually how to build resiliency to deal with stress. And so that's a new online program that I have if anyone is interested in that. And I want to thank you for your time today. And if you have questions, just let me know. Like I said, I'll stick around a bit. And if you want to just type into chat, I'd love to hear, after all the strategies that we just talked about, which ones you want to commit to trying. And if you have any questions, go ahead and we'll continue for just a little bit. You guys are more than welcome, by the way. Or you can unmute yourselves and just ask a question.
Hi, Robin. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Hi, Laura. It's good to see you.
Yeah, and just let you know, I've been bouncing on on an exercise ball. I bought that because we've been sitting so much here. So it's true. Your presentation was awesome. Just trying different things and
nice.
Knowing what your body, just the different triggers.
Yeah, if we can begin to see it before we hit a 10, we've got a lot more control over how you manage all of that. Yeah. Positivity list, that's a good one to start with. Looking into your nutrition. Yeah. Sometimes when we look at like all the things we should be doing to manage stress, it could kind of seem overwhelming, and not all the strategies will work for all people, right? So we really kind of want to pick and choose the ones that we know will work for us. Being attentive to your thoughts obviously is huge. It's all about shifting your mindset. And that, by the way, is easier said than done when you consider what your thoughts are. Because if we have 50,000 thoughts a day, we're not even closely aware of what we're saying to ourselves, right? We might be aware of like 1% of that.
Hey, Robin.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that second to the last chart, slide rather, because it had like 10 different categories of self-care. There was a lot of information on that slide. Yeah. Yes. The 8. This is really powerful because it sort of compartmentalizes it for me, and I can look at, you know, what areas am I proficient in, which some of them I'm very proficient, but others are, you know, you've got that, like that wheel of self-care. And
wheel of life.
Yeah, and how can you be, you know, at a comfortable level in all the areas? It doesn't always work like that, and you get the bumpy wheel.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point, Sarah. There's an activity that we do called the Wheel of Life. And so when we compartmentalize areas of our life, like for instance, we might be really good at taking care of, say, physical, but financial is kind of stressing us out. If we don't actually look at all of the components in our life, as much as we think we're really good at compartmentalizing, we're not. And so then we have certain negative things that are running in the background. I heard somebody say this the other day. It's kind of like with your computer, it has a bunch of open windows in the background. So if you have things that you're worried about, but you're not addressing, those windows are open in the background. And the more windows you have open in the background, the more energy it's actually draining, right? And so we want to look at all of these. When I use this with my clients, I have them go through each category and just identify something they can do to take care of themselves in each category to make sure that they actually have that balance. Yes, I would be happy to send you guys a slide if you don't mind. Just Keisha, obviously I have your email, but if you guys could email me, so I have your email, I'm happy to send those out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another question is, do I have resources for breathing and breath work? I do. I actually, if you want some information on things like mindfulness and meditation, yes, absolutely. I'm not big on like meditation. I'm not going to set aside 20 minutes to try to clear my mind. I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to do that, but I absolutely love guided meditations. I have a bunch of those recorded that I would be happy to share with you guys. And then I have a list of some resources to help you with guided meditation as well. And a lot of those incorporate some breath work in it. The easiest thing to remember for breath work, right, is the exhale is what signals to our body that we're relaxed. So one of the things that I do is I inhale, I'll hold it. And when I inhale, I want to make sure that my tummy sticks out. That's because I'm getting all of the oxygen to my tummy, not just to my chest. I'll breathe in for 4. I'll hold for 4, and then I'll exhale for 4. If I can exhale for 5 or 6, even better, because that's signaling to my body that I'm in a relaxed state. All right, what do you guys think? Anything else?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Again, feel free to email me if you want any resources or you have any additional questions. I really appreciate you guys. I know there's 101 other things that you could be doing with your time, so I appreciate you spending this hour with me this morning. It was nice to see you all.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.